It is a great pleasure to have Professor Peter Berger with us again at Gordon College. How should one introduce Professor Berger, the renowned sociologist of religion, who is often called the most important sociologist of religion of the past 50 years? Isn't it almost redundant to mention that his book, The Social Construction of Reality, co-authored with Thomas Luckmann, is among the top 5 sociological books of the 20th century, according to the International Sociological Association. Officially, Peter Berger is a professor emeritus at Boston University, where he founded and directed BU's Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. Unlike other emeriti, though, Professor Berger is still engaged in highly original research. Last year, Peter Berger came to Gordon to discuss his views on religion and his take on the so-called secularization theory and other current issues. This time, we want to talk about his latest book, which is again a groundbreaking work that has the potential to become a leading book in the field of sociology. If it were written in a different genre, we would probably attach the label an instant classic to it, because this is a book that deserves a wide audience, both for its content and also for its engaging and non-technical style. What makes Peter Berger's book particularly interesting to read, especially for somebody who's not a sociologist like me, and this is certainly true for the book under discussion, The Many Altars of Modernity, is the fact that Professor Berger does not proclaim dogmas, but he often buffers his convictions with phrases such as, "I think," or "such and such seems to be the case," which I find very nice. It's not dogmatic. Unlike other academics, Peter Berger has a wonderful sense of irony and especially self-irony, a trait that makes reading his books even more pleasurable. So without much further ado, please welcome Professor Berger with me. So Peter, you've done it again. You've written yet another book. Why this book?
Well, first let me say I'm glad to be again here. I've been here before. I like Gordon College. I should tell you I'm in a wheelchair, not to impress you with my patriarchal wisdom, but I really need it. I fractured my hip and have difficulty still walking. Gregor, thank you for a very nice introduction. When people say very nice things about me, I feel I should sort of I can't shuffle right now, shuffle my feet and say, "Shucks, not me." But then I remember what Golda Meir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, is supposed to have once said to one of her ministers, "Don't be so humble, you're not that important." Why this book? Well, I could give you the 10-hour lecture or the 10-minute one. I think 5-minute would be better. You mentioned secularization theory. In my younger years in sociology of religion, I, like almost everyone else in the field, worked with that theory, which was not completely crazy. There are some things I think one can salvage from it. But what the theory essentially meant was the more modernity, the less religion. Modernization means necessarily a decline of religion. And in my early work, I assumed that, like everyone else assumed it. I didn't prove it, I assumed it. Seemed reasonable. Well, it may have been reasonable, it was also wrong. And it took me about 25 years to come to the conclusion that this theory is untenable. The world today is not less religious, it is furiously religious, most of it. Furious, I don't mean in a negative sense, but passionately religious. There are some exceptions. Europe is a very interesting exception. There's an international intelligentsia which is really secular. But most of the world isn't secular at all. I was not alone, by the way. Most people in the field reached the same conclusion about the same time that I did. With that different experiences, different things we read and experienced, which led to that conclusion. And ever since I came out of the closet as a critic of secularization theory in 1999 with a little book, it's no longer, it's obsolete. But And ever since I thought, what should replace it? I mean, it was a paradigm. Everyone used it. And I think we need a new paradigm. And I thought probably it should be a theory of pluralism. Because while modernity does not necessarily produce secularity, it necessarily produces pluralism. And I think one can show this. This has enormous implications for religion. It has a challenge. It's a challenge for religious traditions, but it's a different challenge from secularity. And it's very important to understand that. Mm-hmm. So the ideas of this book came together now about 3 years ago. And then I was invited by someone you may know, Detlef Pollack is a professor in Münster, and he has something called the Center for Modernity and Religion. And he was an old secularization theory person, and he got a lot of money in Germany. The government finances centers of excellence, they call it. For some reason they use the English word, I don't know. And he got a Center of Excellence grant to start this program, Modernity and Religion, and he invited me to give the opening lecture. So I came out of the closet for the first time with the ideas which ended up in this book. And it was a very funny occasion, because he thought he was, from his point of view, inviting a critic of his ideas. And then he ended up really agreeing with me. And since then, we've both been going around talking about, well, I don't think he likes to use the word paradigm. He thinks it's too megalomaniac. It isn't really. It means a new model of thinking. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that interested me, which I talked about in Münster, was what are the political implications of pluralism? Mm-hmm. How is pluralism managed politically? Mm-hmm. And a very important step in the management of pluralism in Europe was the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics, and ended horrible bloodshed. And we said, we've now established the Peace of Westphalia between secularization theory and its critics. And we laughed. So that's basically what happened, and this happened now 2.5 years ago, more or less. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a book in the meantime. And thanks to the lady who sits here, who was my editor at the Gruyter, Alyssa Jones-Nelson. It's in your hands now. And we'll see what happens to it.
I think quite a bit will happen with it, because it's a very intriguing theory, and I think it is a new paradigm. I agree with you that this is really very different, a different approach. And to me, at least, even though I'm not a sociologist by training, it makes perfect sense. Now, I said in the beginning that something that fascinates me about your books is, and particularly about this one, it's not very technical. It is, even though you incorporate a number of very complex concepts, but they're often fleshed out and illustrated by very memorable events, and sometimes events that you experienced yourself. Cognitive dissonance and cognitive contamination are such terms. Could you tell us what you mean by those terms, and do you remember the illustrations you used in the book for these terms?
You can remind me. I don't remember the illustration, but I can certainly explain the terms. Cognitive dissonance is not my term. It was coined by Leon Festinger, an American psychologist. And it means what happens when people encounter information or viewpoints which challenge what they used to believe. And then there's dissonance. Cognitive contamination, I'm guilty of. I don't mean the fact, I mean the concept.
Right.
And I mean by that something very simple that all of us have experienced in one way or another. If people talk to each other long enough, they influence each other's thinking. And that has enormous implications. And pluralism means that everyone talks to everyone else.
Right.
And while today there are still very strong religious communities, but they are no longer, it's almost impossible to be isolated. And the dissonant voices are all around us, which is a very serious challenge to any tradition that claims truth. Mm-hmm. Let me quickly say, I'm not saying it makes it impossible to proclaim truth, but it makes it different.
The illustration that you used in the book was that of a mental institution. And Three Patients.
Oh, yeah. Milton Rokeach's book.
Right,
yeah.
right. Which is a wonderful illustration. Do you want to talk about that? Which is...
Yeah, Milton Rokeach was a psychologist. He's probably not alive anymore. He wrote in the 60s, I think. And it's called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, by which he didn't mean the town in Greece where Byron died. It's a town in Michigan where there's a big mental hospital. And Festinger was, I think, teaching at Ann Arbor at the time, so he wrote about something that was close by. And it's a hilarious story, very interesting story, that there was a patient in the hospital who thought he was Jesus Christ. He was schizophrenic. And then another patient was a new one arrived, who also thought he was Jesus Christ. And the psychiatrists were worried, how would these two get along? And they did get along. And they established a kind of, let me in use of my terms, a cognitive compromise. Mm-hmm. They arrived at a formula which allowed both of them to say they were Jesus Christ. Now, needless to say, they were not exactly theologically correct in terms of any real Christian tradition, but between the two of them, they found a way of dealing with the dissonance. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, a rather sophisticated way.
I find this quite intriguing, this idea of cognitive contamination, and this idea that we kind of infect each other, get contaminated by different ideas. That question actually was a question that Tal Howard and I were talking about earlier. What about your own contamination? How contaminated do you feel when it comes to your own thinking? That is, when you think about the influences in your work, where do most of your influences come from?
In sociology?
Sociology.
Well, very unoriginal. I mean, I was trained at the New School for Social Research, which was then, I don't think it's so much now, a place, very classical European sociology. So it was Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, big influences. But let me make one point here in terms of my own thinking. This is a book in sociology. Mm-hmm. And I think I would have written the same book if I had been an atheist or a Buddhist or whatever. I believe in the objectivity of social sciences, which at the moment is not a very fashionable point of view, but I think a very important point of view. And my giving up secularization theory had nothing whatsoever to do with my own religious beliefs, mm-hmm. which have been pretty much the same since I was a young man. And began thinking about religion systematically. As I put it the other day to somebody, I'm incurably Lutheran. And that hasn't changed. I'm still incurably Lutheran. Although I find the present condition of Lutheranism anything but inspiring. So I don't know, I think I got away from your question. What was your question?
No, actually, that explains the two questions I had about the cognitive contamination when it comes to your work as a sociologist, but also as a lay theologian. So you would say it hasn't really changed. You've remained incurably Lutheran over the last decades. Okay. Now, going back to your book and going back to the notion of pluralism, you mentioned that pluralism is also linked to cities. And I find that quite interesting.
To cities?
Cities, yes. What's the connection?
Well, cities from ancient times have been places where different kinds of people met and lived together. So cities are the foci of pluralism even today. In the 1930s, there was a French sociologist of religion, Gabriel Lebras, who studied very boring stuff mostly. He studied Catholic practice in different parts of France. Okay. And he found significant geographical differences. And he studied what happened to migrants who moved from Brittany, which I think even today is the most Catholic part and province of France, to Paris, which has very pluralistic already in the 1930s, even more pluralistic now. And the only funny passage in all of Lebras' many books is he said there must be in the Gare du Nord, which is a northern railway station where migrants from Brittany came to Paris, there must be a magic pavement where as soon as people step on it, they cease being Catholic. Well, I don't think there's a magical pavement in the Gare du Nord, but Paris is a place of cognitive contamination. Mm. And that's true of most cities today, more so than ever. And actually in European literature and American literature, there's a lot of stories of people who come from narrow backgrounds, small town, villages, rural areas, and come to the city. And suddenly the world changes. New ideas, new ways of life. And that's cognitive contamination. Now the term is medical and sounds negative, but it doesn't have to mean anything negative. It means we are social beings and we are influenced by the people we live with and talk with.
And you also say in your book that as human beings we don't have really good instincts, and so we were confronted with many choices, and we have a hard time when it comes to making these choices because we lack these instincts. Is that one of the reasons why pluralism seems to be, or this type of contamination seems to be inevitable?
Well, it inevitably occurs. Now you can, certain states or movements can try to suppress it. And right now in the world today, I would say radical Islam is the most radical and dangerous, I would say, it's a value judgment, but I would make it, form of this suppression of pluralism. The basic motive of radical Islam is to fend off pluralism and make their notion of Islam coercive in a particular society. And that gets me directly to one of the big challenges of pluralism, that religious certainty becomes more difficult to attain. We know, I think, in terms of human psychology, that people are most certain of beliefs, propositions, and values if there is a consensus about them in their social environment. And if that consensus breaks down or isn't there to begin with, it's much more difficult to be certain. Which, let me quickly say, is a good thing from a Christian point of view, but I know we'll get to that later in your interview. But pluralism has meant, and I would say modernity has meant, an enormous movement in the human condition from destiny to choice. And that affects religion. Through most of history, you had the religion of the place where you were born and grew up. Even in Germany until recently, where, well, since World War II when populations got mixed up, if you gave your address, people could guess whether you were Protestant or Catholic. This is no longer the case. But that was the normal condition through most of human history. You didn't choose to be a Protestant or a Catholic or anything else. It was your fate to be that. That's rarely the case today. And what's required now is a decision on whatever level of sophistication. This can be very sophisticated. It can be quite trivial, people who have no great intellectual interests. But it's a choice. Let me quickly give a footnote to this. You want to talk about these things later? Evangelical Protestants should have the least problem with this statement. Evangelical Protestantism, as far as I know, it's not my community, but I know it quite well, is, I think, the only major religious tradition in the world where an act of individual choice is at the center of the faith. You cannot be born a Christian. You have to be born again as a Christian. It's a personal choice to use that language to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, which is a profoundly modern statement. Okay, that's the challenge to religion. Certainty has become a scarce commodity, not scarce, more difficult commodity. It's not given. You have to achieve it. You have to choose it.
I think we'll come back to some of the things that you said in the Q&A session, I'm sure, and I can already hear it that people will quote from John chapter 3 and so forth, but that's for later, I'm sure. But living without certainty, how is that possible? Isn't certainty something that people, especially religious people, need, crave for?
Well, that has always been the case, but it's very difficult to get it now. And you can have... Look, let me put it this way. The opposite of faith is not unbelief. The opposite of faith is knowledge. I think I know that I'm right now in Wenham, Massachusetts, and that you are Gregor Thuswaldner. A philosophy instructor in Philosophy 101 could prove to me that I can't really be certain of this. I could be dreaming all of this. You don't exist, you're a dream of mine. And I could also say, I don't know that Gregor is not an axe murderer. I know him fairly well. But basically, I have faith that he's not. I trust him. He's not a faith murderer. But I don't know this. Mm-hmm. Religion is no exception to this. Certainty means a claim to knowledge. And if I recite one of the classical Christian creeds, I think I'm making a statement of faith, not of certainty. Some of you may not like this conclusion, but anyway, I think speaking as a sociologist, that is the situation of most people in a modern or even somewhat modernizing society.
Mm-hmm. So faith and knowledge, the two shall never meet?
In this life, probably not.
That's interesting. I think there will be quite a few questions at the end about this, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Very interesting. Now, since people crave certainty, you mentioned in your book that there are two phenomena that seem to be related, relativism on one hand and fundamentalism on the other hand, because they seem to be responses to this lack of certainty in our world. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, relativism is, for one thing, a philosophical theory, known as postmodernism these days, which says there is no truth, everything is relative, and use their language, everything is a narrative, all narratives are equal, which means, I think, a kind of intellectual nihilism. And the other one, fundamentalism, I think, can be easily defined as a claim to a new or renewed certainty. And every fundamentalist movement doesn't have to be religious, it can be a political movement, or a lifestyle movement, even an aesthetic movement. Says, look, join us, and you will have the certainty you've always craved. And that's not a false statement. If you really believe that package that they offer, you will feel certain. I would say that certainty is an illusion. Mm-hmm. But it's attractive. And right now, I read quite a few European publications, and it's full of stories of these young people, some teenagers who leave their families and go to Syria or Iraq to fight with the jihadists. What attracts them? Some are psychopaths. They like to cut people's heads off, I think. Some are under some illusion that Islam means a just society. But I think there's an attraction of certainty. These people really claim that they know the truth, that they own it. And that's attractive. I think both of these options, relativism and fundamentalism, are mistakes. Because relativism, if carried to its logical conclusion, means that anything goes, which among other things would be the end of any human society. Somebody takes your parking space, you kill him, okay? There's no moral truth that you can't do that. And fundamentalism is, I would say, empirically more possible. But under modern conditions, it's only possible in a kind of, either if it's a whole society, a totalitarian society, where the police make sure there's no cognitive dissonance, or you can have a sectarian group which people join or remain in voluntarily, but they create a kind of mini-totalitarianism. And if you look at the sociology of sects and cults, and that's very much what happens. And I can give you the formula if you want to start one. I could tell you how to do it. I will not do it because I think it would be immoral. But it can be done.
Well, I guess the better alternative is a pluralistic society.
I think so.
I would agree. But let's talk about our pluralistic society. The United States has been very successful, actually, in creating a pluralist place. Can you tell us about the mechanics of that? That is, how has the United States managed it to manage pluralism in such a way, in such a very productive way?
Well, I'll say something very unoriginal. It has to do with the American political system. And the United States has been a pretty pluralistic society from the beginning. It's now much more pluralistic than it used to be. Then it was sort of different kinds of Protestants at each other's throats, but now it's anything. The other day I met the Buddhist chaplain of Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. Very interesting. But it's a combination of pluralism and religious freedom. And I think some of it was accidental. I mean, Jefferson, who, as far as I remember from my history, introduced religious freedom into the Constitution of Virginia in pre-colonial times, and he passionately believed in religious freedom. But mostly it happened because no group could manage a monopoly. The Episcopalians tried it in Virginia, the Congregationalists tried it in Boston and in New England, but they couldn't do it because there were too many of these other people around. And then I think idealism and practicality met in a rather fortunate way. And religious freedom today is very much of a reality in America and in most Western democracies, although the political systems are different. But say England or Britain, England, which has a state church, monarch is the head of the Church of England, has religious freedom. It just defines it in a funny way for American ears. So I think this has been a very successful experiment. Some tensions here and there. There was Mormon polygamy, there was the debate over slavery. And it hasn't been utopia, but compared to many other societies, it's been very successful. Now, I don't think the rest of the world is going to adopt the first amendment to the Constitution, translated into, I don't know, Russian or Chinese. But some kind of separation of religion and the state is a very workable formula. Now, I believe in the value in itself, but even from a purely practical political point of view, it works.
And I think it works also at Gordon, because that is also, in a way, a pluralistic community to a certain extent. There are about 40 plus denominations represented on this campus. I think a couple of centuries ago, we would have probably killed each other. I guess, religious denominations were not as tolerant in former times, but now things are different. But I'm interested in the fact that in the effect that pluralism has on religious cultures, religious communities. How does it affect the epistemology, the theology of Christians, for example?
Well, the most obvious thing is that every church, let me use Christian terms for the moment, but you could say any religious institution, whether they like it or not, become a voluntary association. Under conditions of religious freedom, you cannot, if you're a clergyman of any kind, you cannot count on the police to force people into your pews. They have to come voluntarily and they have to stay voluntarily. That's an enormous change. And it affects the relationship of churches to their members. The laity becomes much more important. It changes the relationship of groups to each other, who for practical purposes have to somehow accommodate each other. The American concept of denomination is the example of this. Richard Niebuhr defined a denomination as a church that accepts the right of other churches to exist. Not a bad definition. And it affects, of course, the relationship of religion to the state. I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something about the American case, but I think I've said the essential thing I would say.
Speaking of the separation of church and state, there are obviously different manifestations, different versions of that separation when you compare the United States to France, and both are pluralistic societies. What is the difference there when it comes to the separation of church and state?
Well, the French have, and probably that has to do with their Catholic history, predominantly Catholic history, have the notion that the state should supervise religion in some fashion. And in terms of the French concept of laïcité, a political concept, that the public sphere must be free of religion. And that comes from centuries of having problems with the Roman Catholic Church, which has tried to establish a monopoly. De facto, there is religious freedom in France. And the differences are not as great as some people think. For example, the French government pays the salaries of teachers in religious schools, which would be unthinkable in the United States, would be unconstitutional. So there's not one form of separation, but some notion that the state is religiously neutral or uncommitted, I think is a very helpful idea. I gave a lecture in Beijing about 3 years ago at a university which is famous for training communist cadres. And I made that point. I didn't preach American political system to them, but I said that every country has it, including China, but you must be the judge of that, would be well advised to institutionalize religious freedom because it makes for, take the Confucian ideal of harmony. A harmonious society is much more likely if people tolerate each other's religions. Then, of course, what about religions which are harmful, like radical Islam? I said, well, then that you're not tolerant of that. But the basic formula is people tolerate each other and they can express their views, their religions.
There was another question I wanted to ask you about, yes, and that has to do with discourse. As I said before, I'm not a trained sociologist, but I am interested in discourse. And one of the chapters in your book focuses on secular discourse. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, and I can go back to what we talked about, 20 minutes ago or so. where secularization theory was not completely wrong. Look, Charles Taylor wrote this huge book called The Secular Age, which is a book weapon. If you hit somebody with that book, you could be charged with manslaughter. It's already wrong in the title. We don't live in the secular age. But there is a secular discourse, which Taylor exaggerated in its power. But there are many institutions in a modern society, or even an incipiently modernizing society, which must operate with the secular discourse. One example I gave, I know a successful surgeon in Boston who's a practicing Orthodox Jew. And I saw him in his office, and he wears a yarmulke. And another patient I was sitting there, he did something for my eyes. He said, oh, he's a real mensch, Yiddish term, is a real human being. And I think that has to do with his religion. I think he understands his vocation as a doctor, as being God's will. But in the operating room, he can't operate with that discourse. First of all, you can't see if he wears a yarmulke because he has one of those surgical hats. And as he does his surgery, every move he makes must be in terms of a secular discourse. That doesn't mean he betrays his religion at all. But at the moment, his attention must be elsewhere. And even if one of his patients should be equally Orthodox Jew, he would sue the doctor if he thought he operated by consulting the Talmud while he was doing surgery. You can't do that. You have to use a secular discourse. And that probably originated with modern science and technology, but it spread to other areas, such as the notion of a religiously neutral state. And when I was starting to work on the book, for the first time I stumbled on the work of Hugo Grotius, a Dutch jurist. Some of you may, I heard of him, I never read him before. 17th century. He was one of the fathers of modern international law. And he said, modern international law has to act, he said it in Latin, as if God did not exist. It had to be formulated as if God did not exist. In other words, a purely secular discourse. Now, he had no choice. He was working in Europe in the 17th century. There were Catholic states, there were Calvinist states, there were Lutheran states, there was Russia, which was Orthodox, there was the Ottoman Empire. If all these people were going to be bound by international law, you couldn't talk about God. Which God are you talking about? Et si Deus non daretur, as if God is not given, was his formula. That is the root formula of secular discourse. Now, Grotius, I read up on Grotius, was not an atheist at all. He not only believed in God, he was a very pious Protestant. He was an Arminian, which I would call a more humane form of the Dutch Reformation. And in fact, the Calvinists, who were then in charge of the newly independent Netherlands, forced him into exile. He ended up in England, which was more tolerant at the time. It doesn't mean that he was no longer a Christian. It meant, as an international lawyer, if he were asked to make a judgment, it had to be in a religiously neutral discourse.
It's interesting, this particular phrase, because it seems diametrically opposed to a mantra that we use at Gordon College quite a bit, but also many other Christian colleges that have been influenced by a certain strand of Reformed theology, this integration of faith and learning that is taking place here, that is that faith and learning have to be brought together. And it seems that you're suggesting something else.
No, I mean, I think if you're a thinking person who has faith, you want to relate somehow, but you believe as a Christian with what you learn as a historian or a physicist or whatever. I think that is understandable, almost inevitable. But there is no such thing as a Christian chemistry. I don't think there's such a thing as a Christian sociology. There may be Christian thinking about what society should be like. Yes, that's a different story. When I work as a sociologist, I don't have a uniform like the Jewish surgeon, but I act in a way like a doctor doing a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. But I think I think that's quite intriguing. And by the way, there's an online controversy going on that you can read up on. I think Roger Olson, Baylor, responded to that, and you can read that online if you're interested. Quite interesting. Obviously, the different approaches one can take when it comes to that. I'm just interested in, how, if you are a Christian and you are informed by your faith, and your faith is part of your identity, does that mean that by the time you leave church, you leave that behind? That's something, of course, that pastors always fear, that on Monday everybody forgets what they heard on Sunday. Or do you think that it can still show, even in the secular sphere, that there are Christians in very mundane activities or so, based on a certain code of ethics and so forth?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are certain things in the world which I think a Christian can reject on moral grounds. I spent several years working on South Africa, and apartheid was an evil, which I think for many people, from a Christian point of view, was untenable. But that's not, I think, what we're talking about. And coming back to my Jewish surgeon, I don't think he left his faith at the door of a hospital or of his clinic. I think there's a classical rabbinical concept, tikkun olam, which means the repair of the universe. I think he regarded his vocation, I don't know him personally, he did my cataract surgery, but I would imagine he saw his vocation as a repair of the universe, to which every pious person should be committed. But that doesn't change the fact that he had to put this aside when he was doing surgery. He may remember it some of the back of his mind, but his attention is elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Right, but the motivation could be...
His motivation could be profoundly religious.
So, on the one hand, it may seem like a separation, but on the other, it may not be.
Well, I don't know what you mean. I mean, it means there is a secular discourse. And in certain situations, we have to use it. Or we can't do what we are supposed to do.
I think we'll have some questions later on. I think some follow-up questions here. But I think that's an intriguing idea. And, reading your book, I was thinking, where could this come from? I mean, by not knowing anything about you, I would probably say, no, this is not, if I know that, you're a Christian, this is a Christian author, Peter Berger is a Christian author, but his background, what is his background? I would never say Reformed. I think a Reformed sociologist would probably look at this differently, I think. And the fact that you're Lutheran, I think makes perfect sense to me, because in Lutheranism you have this,
the two kingdoms.
Exactly, the doctrine of the two kingdoms. So, in a way, I was thinking that maybe even your book is, if you want it or not, informed by your Lutheran convictions. Well,
I don't think so, but it's certainly easily reconciled with my theological views. And I think there is something very Lutheran about this. But you don't have to be a Lutheran to have that point of view.
Right.
And I would imagine there are reformed possibilities of formulating something similar. But there is a different... when Luther had this big debate with Zwingli in Marburg, I think, and he said, who was then the head of the Swiss Reformation, a different spirit speaks out of you. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the kind of commonwealth that Calvin established in Geneva and the Puritans established in New England would be difficult to do under a Lutheran regime. It could be done, has been done.
Well, let's go back again to the theme of pluralism and how it affects everyday Christians. What's the effect on a person's faith and also on institutions of faith?
Well, look, in terms of institutions, what I said before is that I said a church, whether it likes it or not, becomes a voluntary association.
Right.
And the model case for this is the Roman Catholic Church. And take the 100 years, almost exactly 100 years, between the First Vatican Council and the Second Vatican Council. First Vatican Council was convened by Pius IX, who was the author of the Index of Prohibited Doctrines, prohibited books. Basic principle was error has no rights. The Catholic Church contains all truth, and I don't think was in favor of killing those who disagree, but there's no salvation outside the church, and religious freedom wasn't part of the message. In the Second Vatican Council, it became the center of the message. And not only as a grudging acceptance of what cannot be changed, which happened with Catholics in the United States and in France, incidentally. They had to accept the fact that there was a regime which was not Catholic. No, Vatican II, under the influence, interestingly enough, of two theologians, one an American, one a Frenchman, two mother countries of modern democracy, John Courtney Murray and Jacques Maritain. There is the passage in one of the decrees, or whatever it's called, of the Vatican Council, which had the theological rationale for religious freedom. Religious freedom was not something that the church should grudgingly accept, but should proclaim as a basic human right, part of the dignity of human beings, that they decide what their relationship is to ultimate realities. That's an enormous change, huge change, and I think a very desirable one. Now, are people who have gone through this, are they less Christian or even less Catholic than they used to be? Well, they're Catholic in a somewhat different way. But I know quite a few Catholics who are very much believe the Second Vatican Council was a good thing. And they believe in this human right of religious freedom, but they're still committed Catholics. So the Catholic case, I think, is paradigmatic in a way.
There's another question I wanted to ask you, and it has to do with, again, with pluralism and how it affects Christians and Christians of the present and of the future. As you surely know, the famous theologian Karl Rahner famously said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he will not exist at all." I don't know if you've heard that before. But I was just wondering, reading your book, would it be fair to add that the Christian of the present and especially of the future will need to be agnostic too? Meaning, if we are confronted with so much pluralism, doesn't that mean that that will also question even more of our certainty? That Christians, people of faith in general, will have to become more agnostic?
Well, Gregor, it depends what you mean by agnostic. I mean, if you mean what the literal Greek word means that I don't know, but I have faith, then yes, I think Christians will become more agnostic. That doesn't mean they will become less Christian. And they will also have to accept the secular discourse where it applies. Look, I don't know what Rana meant by mysticism. I think he probably meant some kind of personal experience rather than mysticism in the technical sense, but which is probably correct. But one of my favorite, I don't have many favorite Catholic saints, but one I'm rather fond of is Teresa of Avila, who was a remarkable woman who reformed in the 17th century, along with St. John of the Cross, reformed the Carmelite order in Spain. She was a real mystic. I mean, she went into ecstasy and stood before the throne of God. In those mystical experiences, the world disappeared. The only thing that existed was God. But she administered, she was the chief abbess or whatever, of the Carmelite order of nuns in Spain. And she was apparently a very good administrator. So she had to look at the books of these convents. Where did this money go? We have so many pesetas here, where are they? At that moment, she couldn't be in one of her mystical ecstasies. She began to use a secular discourse of, in this case, accounting. This doesn't make her less of a religious figure.
But I'm just wondering about the implications, the many implications of pluralism for believers. Since, it seems that when we're dealing with the state or outside of the religious communities, we enter into, according to your book, a secular discourse. Does that mean that religion is now relegated to the private sphere?
No.
Why not?
No.
How so? If you're supposed to use secular discourse outside of the religious communities.
Look, there's a secular discourse which dominates the actions of the state, including the law. Now, if we talk about the United States or France, we're talking about democracies. And part of a democracy means that people are free to try to influence the government in terms of their own values. And if they're religious values, they will do that. But they cannot use their own religious terminology if they want to succeed in the political sphere. Because people will say, oh, well, you're a Catholic, but I'm not a Catholic, so I won't listen to you. So the one who wants to propagate a Catholic point of view or a Protestant point of view, or whatever, in the public sphere, has to translate your language into the secular discourse, has to argue that this is not just the parochial Americans with a sectarian view, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, but is in accordance with American values, is practical, is humane, respects human rights. Those are all terms of a secular discourse. Now, the reasons why this individual may be in favor of this law may be profoundly religious, but when he argues for it in the public arena, he can't simply use his own language, religious language. He must speak in terms that every other citizen can understand and possibly agree with.
That's interesting because, in the U.S., sometimes you hear different opposing voices too. In some quarters, proponents of the Christian right tell us that the U.S. is supposed to be a Christian nation, that we should take the country back to its alleged Christian roots, to some golden age, etc. How would you respond to those voices then?
Well, first of all, the golden age is an illusion. And also, in the sentence you quoted, the key phrase is going back. Going back to what? Not to some paradise lost, but going back to a pre-pluralist situation. Well, you can do that. You probably, if you want to do it in an entire society, you have to use coercion. which is exactly what radical Islam does. You don't agree with you, we'll kill you. If you have the power to do that and the intention of doing that, it's possible. It has very high costs, not just human costs, it has economic costs. Why is North Korea a sinkhole from any point of view? Because it really has cut itself off from any cognitive dissonance officially. Can it be done? Can one avoid pluralism? Yes, you can. If you create some kind of totalitarian system, and the fundamentalist sect is a mini-totalitarianism. It can't count on the police, but it counts on psychological pressure, social pressure, and that's very difficult to do. I don't know, one of my favorite cognitive styles is free association. And I was now thinking of my Orthodox surgeon. If you want to see a sectarian world physically, go to Brooklyn. And you got these sections of Brooklyn where no one lives except Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews. And there are some very good novels about this. What happens if a child grows up in such a milieu? Can he or she get out of it? Well, it's difficult psychologically. Everything you know, everyone you know, everyone who's important, everyone you love, is part of that world. Be a tremendous wrenching thing to get out of it. But unless you are completely ignorant of the world in which you live, you know that it can be done. All you have to do is shave your beard if you're a man, take off your modest dress if you're a woman, put on a baseball cap, and take the subway to Manhattan. And there the state and the law will protect your right to not be anymore an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I think that's the answer to your question. Yes, it can be done even without coercion, but you have to create a sectarian ghetto of some sort, which is easier than to create a totalitarian society.
Right.
But still difficult.
Now, we've talked a lot about Christianity, but let's talk about other religions as well. You said that within Hinduism, for example, you find an internal pluralism. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, there are many gods, supposedly 300,000 gods in Hinduism, and people choose. It's very different from the monotheistic religions that came out of Western Asia, out of the Middle East. And that's a kind of internal pluralism. And Hinduism has never been a missionary religion, but its center was always the caste system. And you became a Hindu, well, an individual would have difficulty, but a group somehow finds a place in the caste system. And then it's embraced by the Hindu system. I don't think there's anything that will work outside India, but in India it has worked quite well, still does. Although public manifestations of caste are illegal according to the Indian constitution, it is very much a practical reality for large numbers of people in India. Generally speaking, I would say non-monotheistic religions are more open to pluralism.
Makes sense. Now, let's talk about a monotheistic religion that we haven't really talked about, and that is Islam, and manifestations of pluralism in Muslim countries. Why has it been difficult in some Muslim countries to establish pluralism?
Well, it has been established as a fact. The question is, have political movements succeeded in trying to wipe out that fact? And that, I think, is the inner logic of radical Islam, jihadism. But there are cases of tolerant Islam, and that has been in history some periods of great tolerance of Islam. Muslim Spain was a good example, not the whole history, but certain periods where you had a very tolerant Islam. They used the term conviviencia. Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted peacefully under the Sultanate of Cordoba. Well, then there were reactions against it. You have fundamentalists who wanted to kill all the non-Muslims, but for some period of time it worked. The Ottoman Empire in some of its better periods. Mughal India was quite tolerant, was under Muslim rule. So I think to say that Islam cannot tolerate basically pluralism is not correct empirically.
And of course, case in point, Turkey. Turkey, of course, is a very fascinating example.
Yeah.
Because there you have this coexistence of religious and secular discourse. Now it's even more interesting, I think, because you have an Islamist party in power.
Yeah.
But what I find most intriguing is that they would issue the following statement: we don't want a Sharia state, we want to live as good Muslims in a secular republic. Do you think this democratic experiment in Turkey will continue, even with this Islamist party in power?
I don't know. I have a colleague at Boston University, an anthropologist, Jenny White, who's an expert on Turkish Islam. And when the AKP, the Muslim party, came into power, she was very optimistic. And these statements were made early on. Mm-hmm. Now I'm not so sure. Mm-hmm. And I think a key is the personality of the prime minister who will be president, Erdogan, who, well, we were worrying when the party came into power. I mean people who look at Turkey, that he wanted to be the Ayatollah Khomeini. Turns out he doesn't want to be the Ayatollah Khomeini. He wants to be Suleiman the Magnificent, a new caliphate, Ottoman caliphate, under merger of Islam and Turkish nationalism. I don't know what will happen there. I have no idea. But the great promise of Turkish Islamic democracy right now looks a little shaky. It may change.
So pluralism will not disappear. Places, it seems, will become more and more pluralist. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, unless you have the spread of dictatorships all over the place, which is not impossible. Russia is a very critical case right now. I mean,
the fact that there's no separation between church and state?
Well, there is officially, but the role of the Orthodox Church is increasingly embedded with the state. And there's religious discrimination against Catholics, against Protestants. Look, nothing in history is irreversible. But to change something like the pluralist development, you have to have pretty catastrophic events. They're not impossible. But a futurologist had this wonderful phrase, a surprise-free future. If you imagine a surprise-free future, you can predict present trends to continue. Unfortunately, occasionally fortunately, there are surprises. And,
all right, well, on that note, I think that we should have a maybe not surprise-free Q&A session, but a Q&A session nevertheless.